The first metal struck the marble floor, and Union Station went quiet. A second one fell, then a third, and every one of them carried the name of a person who had once trusted Dr. Eleanor Whitfield with his life. Her hands were cuffed behind her back. A transit officer stood over those scattered honors and called them stolen property. And then a four-star general walked into that station, in his dress uniform, in front of 300 people, and lowered himself down onto one knee to pick them up off the floor, one at a time. The next 11 minutes were argued over in newsrooms and living rooms all across the country that winter, but almost nobody understood what was really inside that broken wooden box, or why a 61-year-old woman would not set it down, not for anything, not even when it cost her the skin on both her wrists. That is the part worth telling, so let's start at the beginning of it, which is a good deal quieter than the end. By the time a woman reaches 61, if she has been paying attention, she has learned that the important moments almost never come with any warning at all. There is no music, nothing announces itself. Sometimes it is only a change in the wind, or a small pause in a stranger's voice, or a quiet certainty that settles down in the chest and says, without any particular urgency, something is about to go wrong. Eleanor Whitfield felt that certainty on a cold November morning, standing on the curb outside Union Station in Washington, D.C., with her breath showing in the air. The station rose up in front of her in pale stone and glass, solemn enough that a stranger might mistake it for a courthouse, and busy enough to hold 100 private worlds inside it at once. Travelers hurried under those high arches with their coffee cups and their rolling suitcases, wearing the distracted faces of people who are already living an hour ahead of themselves. Eleanor stayed on that curb a little longer than she needed to. One gloved hand rested on the old walnut box she held against her coat. It was 22 inches long, and the years had darkened it to the color of strong tea. Somebody had polished the brass corners so many times that they still glowed a little, even under a gray sky. And carved into the lid, carved by hand, by an old man in a garage, one letter at a time, were 9 names. The first belonged to a nurse from Detroit named Naomi Turner. The last belonged to a medic from eastern Kentucky named Leon Grant. And in between were the names of people Eleanor had loved and argued with and depended on and watched grow old in photographs on other people's mantelpieces. 3 of those 9 were still living. Eleanor was one of them, and 2 of them had never come home at all. She touched that last name with her thumb, the way a person touches a door frame on the way out of a house she does not expect to see again. Then she went inside. The whole idea had started 6 months earlier, in Eleanor's own dining room, over a cup of coffee she let go cold while she talked. General Thomas Caldwell had telephoned to say that the National Veterans Medical Association wanted to honor their old detachment. There would be a ceremony, a hall, families invited, if she wanted them. Eleanor's first answer was no. "We did our jobs, Thomas," she told him. "The people who deserve a ceremony are the 2 we couldn't bring home." There was a long pause on the line after that. Caldwell had known her for 32 years by then, and one of the things he had learned about Eleanor Whitfield, learned it the hard way, in a tent, in a bad month, was that you do not fill her silences for her. So he waited, and then he said, "Then let the ceremony be for them." That was the end of the argument, and both of them knew it. That same evening, Eleanor opened a closet she had been walking past, and not opening, since the winter James died. James Whitfield had been her husband for 34 years, and he was the reason anything in that house could be found at all. He had labeled every carton on those shelves in careful block letters, because Eleanor trusted her memory more than she trusted any filing system, and had spent 4 decades losing her keys, her reading glasses, and on 2 separate occasions her automobile in a parking garage. Letters, photos, field hospital, taxes, do not throw out, Eleanor. She sat down on the floor of that closet in her stocking feet, a 61-year-old woman surrounded by cardboard with the hall light on behind her, and she started to read. Ruth Mallory's letters came up first, tied with kitchen string the way Ruth tied everything. Ruth had been the oldest of the 9, and by an enormous margin the least impressed by rank. She was a captain, and a nurse, and a grandmother of 4, and she had a particular way of looking at a colonel that could make a grown man feel like a boy who had tracked mud across her kitchen floor. On the night the evacuation route failed, a full colonel came pushing into their tent, demanding attention for a cut on his hand. Ruth pointed at a row of stretchers and told him, in a voice you could have heard in the next county, that rank stopped at the treatment line. He waited 50 minutes. And when she finally got around to him and cleaned that hand, he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And he meant it. Ruth had that effect on people. Isaiah Brooks was another kind of man altogether. He laughed when he was frightened, which was often, and he sang old gospel songs whenever the generator failed, which was more often than that. He had a voice like a church basement, warm, a little rough around the edges, considerably better than he ever believed it was. During the transport fire that earned him the soldier's medal, Isaiah went back into that wreckage twice after he had been ordered to stay put. He told Eleanor afterward that he hadn't been brave. He said he could hear a young soldier calling for his mother, and he simply could not stand there in the dark and listen to it. That was all. He said it the way another man might explain why he'd picked up a dropped glove. There were others. Captain Miguel Santos could repair very nearly anything using wire, electrical tape, and an unreasonable quantity of confidence. Nurse Helen Crawford remembered every single patient's birthday and made certain somebody sang, even if the singing was terrible, and it usually was. Rebecca Shaw kept a private notebook with the name of every person they lost, because she said that no one on this earth ought to be allowed to disappear into a number. And Peter Lang made the worst coffee in 3 countries and was proud of it. Genuinely proud. The way a man is proud of a bad dog he loves. And then there were the 2. Naomi Turner was the nurse from Detroit, and hers is the first name carved into that lid. She was 26 years old, and she had a gift that no school in the world knows how to teach. Naomi could walk into a room full of frightened men, and the whole room would settle, the way water settles in a glass. She would lay her hand flat on a man's chest and say his first name, just his first name, low, the way you'd say it across a kitchen table, and his breathing would slow right down. Nobody could explain it. People stopped trying after a while and simply sent for her. On the night of the storm, word came in that a transport had gone off the road 2 miles out, with wounded still inside it. Naomi went with the 2nd ambulance. She was the first one out through the tent flap and into that rain. Not because anybody had told her to go, but because nobody had thought to tell her not to. She did not come back. Leon Grant was 21 years old, a medic from Kentucky, with a soft accent and a pair of enormous hands that surprised people. Leon wrote letters home for men whose hands were bandaged. And here is the thing about it. He wrote them well. Better than the men could have written for themselves, most of them, and he never once let a soldier feel small about needing him to do it. He'd sit down on the edge of a cot with a pencil and say, "All right, what do you want her to know?" And then he'd take it down, word for word, and read it back, and fix whatever the man wanted fixed. Leon went out on that road too, to help carry the wounded in. He did not come back either. They found a letter in his own pocket afterward, unfinished, addressed to his mother in Kentucky. It began, "Ma, don't worry about me. I'm about the safest one here." That was 32 years ago. Eleanor had been 29 years old that night, a captain, the youngest surgeon in the detachment, and the one whose name happened to be on the letterhead. She was on her feet for 19 hours. 14 casualties came through that tent before morning. 12 of them lived. The Army gave her a meritorious service medal for it. She put it in a dresser drawer and left it there for the better part of 30 years, because she could never once look at the thing without doing the arithmetic. When Eleanor started writing to the families that spring, she did not ask any of them for medals. She asked them for stories. Ruth Mallory's daughter remembered her mother pulling the car over on interstate highways to help at accidents. At 74 years old, with a bad hip, no matter who begged her not to. She'd just put the flashers on, her daughter said, and hand me her purse. Isaiah Brooks's widow remembered that in 40 years of marriage, her husband could never once sit with his back to a door. 40 years of restaurants, and he always took the seat facing the entrance. He never explained it, and she never asked him to. Naomi Turner's brother, a man of 60 now, still living in Detroit, still had his sister's handwriting on the lid of a shoebox she had mailed to a children's ward one Christmas. He had never been able to throw it out. He mailed Eleanor a photograph of the lid. And Leon Grant's mother had passed on years before, but a niece wrote back to her, in a careful hand, on good paper. The family still had that unfinished letter, she said. Her grandmother had kept it inside a Bible, in the Book of Ruth, for as long as anyone could remember. And in all those years, she had never once read it out loud to anybody. Several families offered decorations that had been sitting in dresser drawers for decades, because hanging them on a wall hurt considerably more than leaving them in the dark. Eleanor said yes to every bit of it, and then she needed something to carry it all in. James had planned to build a case. Of course he had. That was exactly the sort of thing James did. He had bought the walnut himself, and he had drawn out the whole design on the back of a grocery receipt, in pencil, with the measurements marked down to the 16th of an inch. Across the top he had written for Ellie's people, and underlined it twice. Then he got sick. And the board stayed out in the workshop, and the receipt stayed in the kitchen drawer, and neither one got touched for a long while. After the funeral, Eleanor found both of them on the same afternoon. She carried them 2 streets over, to a man named Elias Deacon. 78 years old, a retired Navy carpenter, a widower, and a man who used somewhere around 40 words in a day and considered that a generous allowance. He looked at that grocery receipt for a good long time without saying anything. Then he said, 16ths, and almost smiled. Man was serious. He would not take payment for the work, and he would not discuss it either. When Eleanor pressed him on it, and she pressed him twice, he said, "I'm eating fine," and turned back to the bench, and that was the end of that conversation. He carved those 9 names one at a time, over 5 weeks, and every time he set up to carve one, he let the family come and stand there and watch him do it. Naomi Turner's brother drove all the way down from Detroit for his sister's name. He stood in that garage with sawdust settling on his good shoes and cried without making one sound. And Elias Deacon handed him a shop rag and did not say a single word to him about it, which was, if you think about it, exactly the right thing to do. When the last brass corner went on, Deacon ran his hand across the lid the way a man checks a hull for a soft spot. "It's walnut," he said. "Walnut's not worth much. Worth is what people put in a thing." Then he handed it across to her. "They trusted you with it." That's the whole value of it right there. Eleanor thought about that sentence every single time she picked the box up. Every time. Right up to that morning in the station. She had promised to carry it into the hall herself, and she meant to keep that promise. Caldwell had offered her a military escort, 2 soldiers, white gloves, the whole business, and it would have been handsome. Eleanor turned him down over the telephone without much ceremony. "They came home with me once, Thomas," she said. "I expect I can carry them the last 100 yards." That morning she wore a navy wool coat over a plain burgundy dress, low black shoes that were comfortable because she intended to be on her feet, and the pearl earrings James had given her on their 25th anniversary. Her hair, gone silver at the temples, was gathered up neat at the back of her head. There was nothing about the woman that demanded anybody's attention, that had never once troubled Eleanor. For 30 years she had been walking into rooms where people saw her color, or her sex, or her rank, well before they got around to seeing her work. She had survived every bit of it by holding on to something her mother had told her at a kitchen table in Richmond, Virginia, when Eleanor was 9 years old and had come home crying about the way a woman in a department store had spoken to her. Her mother did not raise her voice. She did not even put down what she was doing. She said, "Your dignity does not get any smaller just because somebody else fails to see it." Eleanor had believed that sentence for 52 years. That morning, she was going to find out exactly how much weight it could carry. Inside, she checked the great clock hanging over the concourse. The ceremony started at 10. It was 8:43. The Remembrance Hall was clear across the station, in the old presidential waiting room, which had been closed off for the morning. She had more than enough time. She thought about getting a cup of tea. What Eleanor did not know, could not possibly have known, was that 17 minutes before she stepped out of that taxi, a man had run out of a military collectibles shop 2 blocks north with a velvet case of commemorative decorations tucked under his arm. The shop owner called it in right away, and his description was a good one. Clear, specific. He said, a young man, roughly 25 years old, dark coat, red knitted cap, carrying a rectangular case, headed on foot toward Union Station. That description passed through a dispatcher, and then through a radio, and then through the small, unavoidable erosions that happen to any message traveling fast between people. By the time it reached Officer Daniel Mercer, 3 details had survived the trip. Dark coat, wooden case, Union Station. That is all he got. And what a man does with an incomplete picture is the entire subject of this story. Daniel Mercer was 33 years old, with 10 years on the transit police. Broad through the shoulders, clean-shaven, and 6 months out from eligibility for sergeant, which he thought about most days. His file held 2 commendations, one for finding a lost 4-year-old in the parking structure, one for helping clear a platform during an electrical fire. That same file also held 2 complaints for unnecessary escalation, both of them closed without discipline. He thought of himself as observant. His supervisors called him decisive, and in 10 years, nobody had ever explained the difference between those 2 words to him in a way he was willing to sit still and hear. He was standing near the eastern entrance with Officer Lena Park when the call came through. Park started reading the full description off the screen inside their kiosk, the way she was trained to. Male, mid-20s, red knit cap, dark, but Mercer had already spotted Eleanor. "I see the case," he said. Park looked up. She followed his eyes across that concourse, and what she saw at the end of them was a gray-haired woman in a wool coat. Dan, that's a woman in her 60s. Caller could have been wrong. About all of it? He did not answer her. He was already walking. Eleanor heard the boots before she heard the voice. She always did. 30 years around men in uniform will do that to a person's ear. "Ma'am, stop right there." She stopped, and she turned around. 3 decades in military hospitals had trained Eleanor Whitfield to read authority in about 2 seconds flat, and she did it now without thinking. She took in the uniform, the badge number, the hand resting near the radio. And the impatience that was already sitting there in the man's face settled in like weather that had come in early. "Good morning, officer," she said. "Is there a problem?" "Set the box down." Eleanor kept both her hands right where he could see them. "This box contains military decorations," she said. "I'd rather not set it on the floor. May I ask why you've stopped me?" His eyes went from her face down to the box and stayed there. "We've got a report of stolen property matching that container." "Then there's been a misunderstanding, and I'd be glad to clear it up. These belong to the Whitfield Medical Detachment Association. I'm carrying them to a Veterans Remembrance ceremony in the presidential waiting room. It begins at 10 o'clock. She started, slowly, to reach toward her coat pocket. "Don't reach." Eleanor stopped. Her hand hung there in the air a moment, and then she brought it back down, careful and open. "My invitation and my identification are in that pocket," she said, perfectly calm. "You are welcome to take them out yourself." Now, it is worth sitting with this moment for a second, because everything that follows hangs off of it. Right there, at that exact instant, this whole morning could still have ended quietly, and nobody would ever have heard one word about it. Mercer could have compared the woman standing in front of him against the description on his own screen, a screen that was 90 feet away. He could have picked up a telephone and called the shop. He could have asked Officer Park, who had caught up by then and was standing right there, to reach into that coat pocket. He could have simply walked Eleanor across the concourse to the hall and let the organizers identify her, which would have taken somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 seconds. Any one of those 4 choices ends this story before it starts. Instead, he looked at the old walnut box in her arms. And he asked her a question that had nothing whatsoever to do with anything on his radio. How did you get military medals? Eleanor heard it. She heard exactly what it was, and she heard it immediately, because she had been hearing versions of that question her entire adult life. He had not asked whether the medals belonged to her organization. He had asked how somebody like her had come to have them at all. I earned 2 of them, she said evenly. The others were entrusted to me by their families. Mercer's mouth tightened. Set it down. Officer, the man you are looking for is young and male and wearing a red cap. Your colleague has that description in front of her right now. Park spoke up then. She's right, Dan. It doesn't match. Not one part of it. Witnesses make mistakes. Eleanor turned toward Park. Would you please take my identification out of my coat pocket? Mercer stepped between the 2 women. I'm conducting the stop, and I am cooperating with it, Eleanor said. But I will not put this box down where 1,000 shoes have walked. Several of these decorations came back to their families after decades in a drawer. One of them is on loan from the National Museum of Military Medicine. The word museum should have been the end of it. In a reasonable morning, that word sends a man straight to a telephone. To Daniel Mercer, it sounded like a woman inventing something impressive. You expect me to believe a museum handed you a box of medals. I expect you to check. By now, travelers had started to slow down. A porter stopped alongside his luggage cart. An older couple paused under the departure board and did not pretend to be looking at it. And a college student named Marcus Bell raised up his telephone. Not dramatically, not shouting anything, just the quiet care of a young man who understood that a record might turn out to matter later on. Mercer saw that camera, and something in him hardened because he felt his authority being measured in public. Last warning, he said. Put the box down and put your hands where I can see them. You can see both of my hands. Eleanor's voice did not go up at all. I am 61 years old. I am unarmed. I am standing 10 feet from your own kiosk. I have offered you identification, an invitation, and immediate verification. Tell me what lawful concern is left. Mercer reached for the box. And Eleanor drew it closer, not to fight the man, not to resist him, but the way you pull a sleeping child toward you on a train platform when somebody comes past too fast. His fingers closed around the brass handle. Let go. Please support the bottom. The hinge is... Let go now. Park stepped in. Dan, slow down. Just let me take her ID. Mercer pulled. That hinge was old brass, set into 30-year-old walnut by a 78-year-old carpenter who had taken his time with it. It gave way. The lid twisted around. The blue velvet tray slid sideways, and the first medal came loose and dropped down onto the marble. It was the soldier's medal, awarded to Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks for going back into a burning transport twice after he was told not to. The second one down was Captain Ruth Mallory's Bronze Star. The third was Eleanor's own. And then the rest of it went ribbons, folded citations, photographs, and 9 small engraved nameplates, scattering out across that polished floor between the shoes of strangers. The concourse fell absolutely silent. 300 people, and you could hear the departure board turning over. Eleanor did not look at Mercer. She looked down, and for one unguarded second, 32 years collapsed into nothing at all. She smelled wet canvas and antiseptic and diesel fuel and rain. She heard young voices calling out for bandages. She felt the terrible weight of a man who had lost consciousness in her arms, and the stubborn little rhythm of another man's pulse under 2 of her fingers. No, she said, barely out loud. and she bent down to pick up the nearest citation. Mercer caught her wrist. "Hands behind your back." Park stared at him. "For what?" "Obstruction. Suspicion of possession of stolen property." "She was protecting the box you just broke." "Lena, step back." Eleanor straightened up, slowly. Grief moved across her face, once, plainly, where every person in that concourse could see it. And then she folded it away and put it somewhere and closed the lid on it, the way she had learned to do a long time ago. "Officer Mercer," she said, reading his nameplate. "Your camera is recording. Your colleague's camera is recording. At least 6 civilians are recording. I am asking you one more time to verify my identity before you take another action. Turn around. My identification is in my pocket. Turn around." Eleanor turned around. The handcuffs closed at 8:51 in the morning. Mercer walked her over toward a stone pillar. Behind them, Officer Park crouched down on that marble in her uniform and started shielding the scattered items from passing feet with her own 2 hands. Marcus Bell kept recording. And the porter, a man named Samuel Green, who had worked 29 years on that concourse and knew every inch of it, quietly rolled his luggage cart around across the walkway so that no traveler coming through could step on the ribbons. Nobody asked him to do that. He just did it. "They have to stay together," Eleanor said, facing that pillar. "Each citation is matched to a nameplate. Please don't mix them up." Mercer began reading the warning off the card he carried in his pocket. "I understand my rights," Eleanor said. "What I don't understand is why you won't read my identification." "Because people carrying stolen property usually carry false papers." Park stood up. She had Eleanor's military ID card in one hand and the embossed ceremony invitation in the other. She had taken them out of that coat pocket with Eleanor's permission, and she held them up. "Daniel," she said quietly, "this is Colonel Eleanor Whitfield, United States Army, retired. The invitation has a federal contact number printed right on the front of it." He barely glanced at it. "Retired ID can be faked. Her photograph is on it. Call it in." So Park called it in. And while she waited on that radio, Eleanor Whitfield stood facing a stone pillar with her hands cuffed behind her back and watched total strangers handle the memory of her friends more gently than the officer had handled her. Samuel Green picked up a photograph off the floor. He did not turn it over to look at the face on it. "Where should this go, ma'am?" "On the velvet, please," Eleanor said. "Thank you for asking." And that one small decency, that one small courtesy from a man with a luggage cart, very nearly broke her composure when nothing else in that station had come close. Across the concourse, General Thomas Caldwell came out of the South Corridor with his aide and 6 members of the ceremony committee walking behind him. Caldwell was 72 years old, tall, with a little stoop in the shoulders now that he had not had at 50, silver hair cut close, and the unhurried bearing of a man who has spent 40 years walking into rooms where the panic has already arrived and is waiting for him. He wore his dress uniform that morning because the families had asked him to. 4 stars on each shoulder. He saw the crowd first. Then he saw blue velvet on the floor. Then he saw Eleanor in handcuffs. And Caldwell stopped walking. His aide started to say something, and the general lifted one hand, barely lifted it, 2 inches, and the aide stopped talking. Then he crossed that concourse. He did not hurry. He had never in his life needed to hurry. And the crowd opened up in front of him, the way water opens in front of a ship. Mercer registered the uniform and came up straight. "Sir, I need you to stay outside the investigation area." Caldwell did not look at him. He looked at Eleanor. "Are you hurt?" "No, Thomas." And the use of his first name changed the temperature of the air in that station by about 10 degrees. Caldwell looked down at the floor. Ruth Mallory's bronze star was lying near the edge of a traveler's shoe. And then, without one word, in the middle of Union Station, in his dress uniform, in front of everybody, a 4-star general of the United States Army lowered himself down onto one knee and picked it up. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial. He set it on the velvet. Then he reached over for Isaiah Brooks's soldier's medal. Mercer cleared his throat. "Sir, those items may be evidence." Caldwell turned the medal over in his fingers, read the engraving on the back of it, and raised his eyes. "They are evidence," he said, "just not of the crime you think." Park's radio came alive right about then. Dispatch confirmed the identity. Colonel Eleanor Whitfield, United States Army, retired. Confirmed the ceremony, 10 o'clock, presidential waiting room. Confirmed the association on file. And then dispatch added one more thing. The actual suspect had been detained 4 minutes earlier outside a bus terminal 3 blocks north. 26 years old. Male. Wearing a red knitted cap. Park turned around to Mercer. Her voice came out flat. "Uncuff her." The color went out of Mercer's face. He looked at the telephones. He looked at the stars on Caldwell's shoulders. He looked, finally, at Eleanor. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding," he said. Eleanor's expression did not change one bit. "The misunderstanding ended," she said, "the moment your colleague read you the description out loud. Everything after that was a choice." Park took the handcuffs off herself. Eleanor brought her hands around in front of her. There were red bands around both wrists, plain enough for anybody to see. She did not rub them. She did not look at them. Instead, she got down on her knees on that marble floor, beside a 4-star general, and started sorting citations. "Mallory's ribbon goes with the second plate." "I remember," Caldwell said. Mercer was still standing there. "Ma'am, I was responding to a reported theft." Eleanor looked up at him from the floor. "Then why did you ask me how a woman like me came to have military medals?" "I never said a woman like you. You didn't need to." Caldwell found a photograph lying face down near his knee. He picked it up and turned it over. And his expression changed. It was a field hospital photograph, taken 32 years back, in daylight, after that storm had finally moved off. Eleanor stood at the center of it, 29 years old, uniform sleeves rolled up above the elbows, hair pulled back, and no expression at all on her face except that particular blankness that comes over people who have not slept. Around her stood 7 wounded service members who were well enough to be on their feet for a picture. One of them was a fair-haired corporal with one arm in a sling. Caldwell looked from that photograph over to the officer's nameplate, and then back again. "Is William Mercer your father?" Daniel blinked. "Yes. How do you—" Caldwell held up the picture. "Because Colonel Whitfield is the reason he came home." Mercer stared at it. There was his father at 24 years old, thinner than Daniel had ever seen the man in his life, hair still light, one arm strapped across his chest. And standing right beside him, with one hand resting on his shoulder, was the woman Daniel Mercer had put in handcuffs 11 minutes ago. On the back, in faded blue ink, "To Dr. Whitfield, who would not let me leave my son without a father. W. Mercer." Eleanor remembered William the second she heard the name, though she had lost track of his last name years before, the way you lose track of 100 last names. He had come in during the worst of that rain. His injuries were internal and hard to see, and another physician looked him over and said he could wait until morning. Eleanor noticed the gray color near his lips and said that he could not. 7 hours it took. The storm had grounded every evacuation flight in the region, so it came down to whoever was in that tent and whatever happened to be on the shelf. When he woke up 2 days after, the first thing William Mercer asked her was whether his baby son would remember him. "Your father carried a photograph of you inside his helmet," Eleanor said now, quietly, to the man standing over her. "You were 6 months old. He showed it to everybody in that ward. Twice, most of them." Mercer looked as though the floor of the station had shifted under his feet. "He never told me your name. Some memories are hard to carry." It was more kindness than he had shown her, and both of them knew that. It did not absolve him of anything, and both of them knew that too. Caldwell stood back up, holding the broken lid in both hands. Colonel Whitfield led the medical team that received 14 casualties in one night after their evacuation route failed, he said, and he said it loud enough to carry across that concourse. She was on duty 19 hours. 12 of those 14 went home to their families. She turned down a public ceremony for 11 years running, because 2 of her own people didn't. These decorations were going to be displayed this morning in their honor. Mercer looked toward the telephones. The certainty that had carried him across that floor 11 minutes earlier was gone now, and something else had moved into the space where it had been. It was fear. But it was not fear for Eleanor, and it was not fear about the harm he had already done. It was fear for his career, and it was written on him plain. "I made a mistake," he said. Eleanor rose to her feet. "A mistake is reading a platform number wrong," she said. "You were given a description that excluded me. Your partner told you it excluded me. I offered you 3 separate forms of verification, and you refused all 3. Then you damaged property that cannot be replaced, and you arrested me for trying to keep it off the floor. I was trying to keep the public safe. The public includes me." Not one person in that concourse moved. Eleanor's voice was not loud. It carried because there was nothing wasted in it. "Safety that depends on who looks like they deserve patience," she said, "is not safety. It is preference wearing a badge." Lieutenant Harold Bennett got there 4 minutes later, 27 years on the job, and he understood before he was halfway across that floor that this was not a thing a quiet apology was going to contain. He separated Mercer from the public. He secured the body camera recordings himself, personally, and did not hand that job to anybody. He called for a medic, and then he called the department's professional standards office, in that order. Eleanor turned down the ambulance but let a young medic look at her wrists, mostly because he asked twice and seemed like he needed to. The ceremony committee offered to postpone. "No," Eleanor said. "We begin at 10. "The box is broken," Caldwell said. Eleanor looked at the contents of it, laid out now on that velvet by 2 strangers and a general. "The people it represents," she said, "were asked to work with a great deal less. Samuel Green went and found a station maintenance worker named Rosa Alvarez, who came back with a small tool case. Between the 2 of them, they reinforced that hinge with 2 brass screws and a strip of dark cloth. The repair was plain, obvious. You could see it from across a room. Eleanor asked them not to hide it. "A scar isn't disrespectful," she told Rosa. "Sometimes it's the most honest part of a thing." At 9:57 that morning, Eleanor Whitfield carried the repaired box into the Remembrance Hall. Caldwell walked beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her, and half a step back, which was deliberate, and which she noticed. Behind the 2 of them came veterans and families and railroad employees and a good number of ordinary travelers who had watched the whole thing and quietly decided that whatever train they were catching could wait for the next one. Officer Lena Park came too, after asking her lieutenant's permission and getting it. Daniel Mercer did not. The old presidential waiting room had received presidents in its day, and foreign delegations, and 1 or 2 kings. That morning, its high windows threw long rectangles of light across rows of plain wooden chairs. And at the front of that hall stood 9 chairs. 6 of them were empty. On each empty seat lay a single white rose and a small card with a name. 2 of those 6 sat a little apart from the others, and their roses were the last 2 placed. Naomi Turner, Leon Grant. The other 3 chairs were not empty. Helen Crawford, 68 years old now, had flown in from Ohio with a cane and a purse full of butterscotch candy, because some things about a person do not change. Miguel Santos, 63, had driven 18 hours from Texas, because he does not care for airplanes and never has, and is not going to start. And the 3rd chair was Eleanor's. She set the medals down on a table covered in blue cloth. Then she stepped up to the lectern, and she looked out at that room, and she put aside the speech she had spent 3 weeks writing. 32 years ago, she began, 9 of us walked into a night that none of us ever completely walked back out of. We had almost no sleep. We were short on supplies, and we had more wounded people than we had hands. We did not ask which patient outranked which. We did not ask where a man worshipped, or how he voted, or what his family was worth, or what color the child was who was waiting up for him at home. Need was the only qualification for our attention. That was the whole standard. It fit on one line, and any one of us could have recited it in our sleep, and some nights we very nearly did. She looked toward the back of the room, where Officer Park was standing in the doorway with her hat in her hands. That principle is not the property of medicine. Every uniform in this country is a promise that a stranger will be treated as a member of the same human family. And that promise matters most. It only matters when nobody important appears to be watching. Nobody applauded right away. The room needed a moment to take it in, and the room took one. Then an elderly veteran in the first row stood up. Then another one, then most of them. Eleanor raised one hand, gently, and asked them all to sit back down. "Today isn't about me," she said. "It is about the 9 names carved into that lid, and about whether we honor them only with ceremonies, or also with conduct." Outside that hall, the recording had already started to travel. Marcus Bell posted only the part that mattered. Eleanor offering identification, twice. Park reading the correct description out loud. Mercer taking hold of the box. The medals coming down on the marble. He blurred out the faces of 2 children standing at the edge of the frame before he uploaded any of it. Nobody told him to do that either. By noon, reporters were telephoning the department to ask why an officer had detained a 61-year-old black veteran while searching for a 26-year-old man in a red cap. Eleanor did not watch that video, not that day. She ate lunch with the families instead. She listened to Ruth Mallory's daughter describe becoming a grandmother in March, and she sat down with Isaiah Brooks's widow and apologized to her for a fresh scratch on his soldier's medal. Mrs. Brooks turned the thing over in her fingers and looked at it. "Isaiah earned this walking into a fire twice," she said. "I expect it can survive a scratch." And then she held on to Eleanor's hand for a good while after that, and neither one of them said anything else about it. That evening, Eleanor drove home to her house in Alexandria. It was very quiet in that house without James. It had been quiet for 2 winters, and she had not gotten used to it, and somewhere along the way she had stopped expecting to. She hung up her coat on the hook by the door. She put the pearl earrings back in their dish on the dresser. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and forgot entirely to drink it, the way she had forgotten 100 cups of tea before it. And only then, in her own kitchen, with the house quiet around her, did Eleanor Whitfield let herself shake. People will often mistake composure for the absence of pain. Eleanor knew better than that, and had known better for a long time. Composure is frequently nothing in the world but pain that has been given its instructions and told to wait its turn. In the station, she had told it to wait. At home, it pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She thought about a hand closing around her wrist. She thought about the sound that first metal made coming down on marble, small, absurdly small, no louder than a dropped coin, and somehow the loudest thing she had ever heard in her life. But mostly, she thought about Mercer's face at the exact moment Park held up the proof. He had not looked confused. He had looked inconvenienced. Caldwell telephoned at 7. "The chief wants to meet with you tomorrow." "Does she want to listen, Thomas, or manage the news?" "Probably both." "Then, we'll help her learn the difference." The next morning, Eleanor walked into police headquarters through the public entrance, like anybody else, and gave her name at the desk, like anybody else. She had turned down Caldwell's offer to come along with her. She wanted the people in that building to understand, from the first minute, that her standing in the world did not require a general standing next to her. Chief Marianne Holt met her with Lieutenant Bennett, the head of professional standards, and a civil rights attorney from the city. Holt apologized without a single qualifier in it. No if, No, however. No, in the context of a rapidly developing situation. She confirmed that Mercer had been pulled off public-facing duty and that every recording had been preserved and copied. Then she asked the question Eleanor had been waiting for. "What outcome are you looking for?" Eleanor had thought about that most of the night, sitting up in her study. "Truth first," she said. "Not a press release about an unfortunate misunderstanding. Publish the full timeline. Include the original description. Include Officer Park reading it out loud. Include my 3 offers of identification. And include the fact that dispatch confirmed everything before those handcuffs came off, not after." Holt wrote it down. Second, review every stop where Officer Mercer detained or searched somebody who did not match the reported description. Not just this year. Go back. The professional standards director looked up from his pad. "That's a wide net. Patterns hide inside paperwork," Eleanor said. "It's the only place they can hide." And third, write a rule. Before an officer detains a person based mainly on a broadcast description, he states out loud, on camera, at least 3 specific details that match. Dark clothing and carrying a box cannot be permission to stop whoever happens to be convenient. Holt closed the folder in front of her. "And fourth," she said. "There's always a fourth." Eleanor looked at her across that table. "Do not ask me to forgive that man on your schedule." Holt did not blink. "I won't." The investigation ran 7 weeks. It found that Officer Daniel Mercer had violated department policy by disregarding information that excluded his subject, escalating without reasonable basis, failing to examine identification that was offered to him twice, and making an arrest unsupported by the facts available to him at the time. But the part of it that mattered most did not come off that video at all. It came out of a file cabinet. At first, those older reports looked perfectly ordinary. Every one of them used the same smooth, professional language. Temporary investigative detention. Officer safety concern. Identity verified. Subject released. No charges filed. Read one at a time, there was not a sentence in any of them that looked remarkable. Laid side by side on a conference table, they told an entirely different story. The first was Reverend Amos Tate, 70 years old, coming home from his sister's funeral. Officers had been hunting a teenager who took a passenger's backpack. Reverend Tate was stopped because he was carrying a black backpack and wearing a gray overcoat. The report recorded that he became argumentative. His own written complaint, filed that same week and never followed up on by anybody, explained that he had asked, repeatedly and politely, why officers were still going through his bag after learning that the person they wanted was 50 years younger than he was. His sister's funeral program was in that bag. It came back creased. The second was Patricia Cole, a retired school principal, standing by a ticket machine waiting on her husband to park the car. The suspect that day was described as white, blonde, in a tan jacket. Patricia Cole is black, wears her silver hair in braids, and had paid cash. She was released after 18 minutes. The report states that she failed to provide a satisfactory account of her presence, as though standing inside a train station required a woman to explain herself to somebody. The third was Darnell Price, a sleeping car attendant, in uniform, with his railroad ID clipped to his chest. He was held during an investigation into missing luggage, and held even after his own train manager confirmed by radio that Darnell had been working 2 platforms away when the bag went missing. No property was ever found. The report commended Officer Mercer's thoroughness. The fourth could not be located, and the fifth agreed to speak only after Eleanor telephoned her personally. Her name was Lorraine Webb. She was 58 years old, and she worked nights as a respiratory therapist. She had never filed a complaint about any of it, and she explained why without any drama at all, the way you'd explain a decision about a car repair. She had been afraid her employer would see her name in a public record and decide she was the difficult kind of employee. Mercer had stopped her near the station pharmacy after a shop employee reported a woman concealing medication. Security footage showed the actual person leaving through a different door inside of 4 minutes. Lorraine sat against that wall for 12 more minutes while her purse was searched. "He kept asking me why I needed so many prescriptions," she told Eleanor. "They weren't mine. They were my mother's. She was in hospice. The hospital had discharged her that afternoon, and I was bringing her medications home." There was a pause on the line. "My mother died the next morning." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Lorraine," she said, "did you get home in time?" The silence on that telephone stretched out long enough that Eleanor nearly spoke again. "Yes," Lorraine said, finally. "I got home. I sat with her about 6 hours. But I lost an hour I didn't know I couldn't spare, ma'am. I have done that arithmetic more times than I should have. And that's the part I can't put down on a form." After that telephone call, Eleanor sat in her study for a long while and let the evening come up in the windows without turning on a lamp. On the wall in that room hung photographs. Hospital units, graduations, a family picnic, and James standing beside a lake, holding up a fish that was far too small to justify the look on his face. She thought about how institutions measure harm. A report can count minutes of detention. It can count bruises, and damaged property, and lost wages. Those things go into boxes on a form, and the boxes add up, and at the bottom of the page there is a number that somebody can act on. There is no box on any form in this country for the last hour at a dying mother's bedside. And there is no box at all for what suspicion takes after the handcuffs come off. The second thought before you walk into a store. The extra 10 minutes you leave yourself every time for the rest of your life. The sentence you rehearse in the car so that it comes out calm. Eleanor asked Lorraine's permission before she gave investigators the name. Lorraine agreed on one condition, that the department never describe her mother's illness publicly. Eleanor saw to that herself, personally, and she checked twice. As the review widened out, the public argument got louder and a good deal less useful. Television panels reduced the whole thing to 2 slogans, facing each other across a desk. Some commentators called Mercer a symbol of everything wrong in American policing. Others accused Eleanor of using a military reputation to ruin a working man over an honest mix-up. Strangers wrote to her demanding vengeance. Other strangers wrote demanding an apology. Hers to him. Eleanor answered neither group, not one letter. One Sunday after church, her younger sister Vivian found her at the dining room table with the mail sorted into 3 piles. Vivian was 67, a retired librarian, soft-voiced, and possessed of no patience whatsoever for foolishness of any kind. "How many people have told you what you're supposed to feel this week?" "Today," Eleanor said, "or altogether." Vivian poured coffee for the both of them without asking. James would have unplugged that telephone by now. James would have called the police chief every morning at 6 o'clock until she changed her number. They laughed at that. And then they didn't. And for a minute, grief sat down at the table with the two of them, like an old relative who no longer requires any introduction and knows where the cups are kept. Vivian picked up a letter off the second pile, pencil, on notebook paper, from an 11-year-old girl in Georgia who had seen Eleanor on the news. The girl wrote that she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, and that she was afraid people wouldn't believe she belonged in a hospital. Vivian set it back down on the table. "This," she said, "is why you keep talking." "And it's exactly why I have to be careful," Eleanor said. "Anger is a flame, Viv. It can light up the room, or it can eat all the air in it. I need mine to give light." There was one part of that winter Eleanor did not handle well, and she would have been the first person to tell you so. 2 weeks into the investigation, Officer Lena Park came to the house. Investigators had reviewed Park's own conduct by then. They found that she had challenged Mercer verbally, that she had obtained the identification, and that she had called dispatch, but that she should have physically intervened before those handcuffs went on, and had not. Park accepted the finding without one word of argument. She stood in Eleanor's front hall, out of uniform, 29 years old, and clearly having rehearsed something in the car on the way over. "Colonel Whitfield, I want to say—" "You watched," Eleanor said. "It came out flat, and it came out cold, and it landed exactly like a slap." And Eleanor heard it leave her own mouth and could not call it back. Park's face went white. "Yes, ma'am, I did." There was a long silence in that hallway. Somewhere back in the kitchen, the radiator knocked twice. Then Eleanor let out a breath. "Sit down, officer, please. That was unfair of me, and I would like to take it back." Park sat. "You read the description out loud when it would have been a great deal easier not to," Eleanor said. "You retrieved my identification, you called it in, and you took the cuffs off my wrists with your own hands, in front of your partner, in front of 6 cameras, before your lieutenant ever arrived to give you any cover for it. It wasn't enough. No, it wasn't. But I have stood in rooms where nobody said anything at all, and I know precisely what the difference is worth. I am 61 years old, and I have no business pretending otherwise because I had a hard morning." Park looked down at her own hands. "I kept thinking I could slow him down without openly opposing him," she said. "I thought if I just stayed reasonable, he'd come back around. Did it work?" "No, ma'am." "Then you remember that answer," Eleanor said, "the next time silence tries to introduce itself to you as teamwork." And Park did remember it. So she helped build a new duty to intervene exercise for the training academy that spring, and she insisted that it require recruits to interrupt a supervisor, not just a peer, because interrupting a peer is easy and nobody on earth needs practice at it. "Courage isn't how clearly you can see that something was wrong afterward," she told a room full of recruits, most of them younger than she was. "Everybody's a genius afterward. Courage is what you're willing to risk while the thing can still be stopped." Eleanor's proposal became department policy that spring, and the shape of it came out of a training room. She sat behind the glass and watched recruits work a scenario. Find a man in dark clothing with a bright green jacket and a noticeable limp. 6 volunteers in dark coats crossed that room at the same moment. One of them pushed a stroller, one carried textbooks, one was mopping the floor. And again, and again, and again, the trainees locked onto the first man who fit the vaguest part of the description, and then went hunting for reasons to make the rest of it fit the person they had already picked. Then one recruit did it differently. She stopped where she stood. She repeated the full description out loud, all of it. She let 3 men walk right past her because not one of them was limping, and she found the correct volunteer without laying a hand on another living soul. Eleanor asked what made her slow down. The instructor checked his roster. 9 years in air traffic control before she came to the academy. "Then teach the rest of them what aviation figured out 50 years ago," Eleanor said. "Assumptions get dangerous the moment people stop saying them out loud." That is where the verbal matching rule came from. Before an investigative detention based mainly on a description, an officer states into the camera at least 3 concrete matching details, or states the immediate danger preventing him from doing it. Simple enough to remember, specific enough to audit. The police union objected that it would slow officers down in urgent situations. Eleanor took 3 minutes at the public hearing, and she did not raise her voice for any of it. "I spent my career making decisions while the people in front of me were losing blood," she told the council. Speed matters. That is exactly why disciplined thinking matters. 10 seconds spent identifying what you actually know can save you 10 years of defending what you only assumed. The rule passed unanimously. Mercer's disciplinary hearing came in February. His union representative had advised him to describe the whole incident as a rapidly evolving investigation. The video made that difficult. Nothing on that recording evolved rapidly except Daniel Mercer's refusal to listen. During the hearing, he watched the station footage from beginning to end for the first time. He had seen the clip online, of course. Everybody had seen the clip. But he had only ever watched it in pieces, the way a man picks at a thing he cannot stand to look at directly. The full recording made him see the spaces between his own actions. The 2 seconds after Park read the description, the 4 seconds while Eleanor's hand hung there near her pocket, the moment he stepped between his own partner and the woman she was trying to help. Every one of those spaces was a place where he could have chosen differently. There were a great many more of them than he remembered. And then came the sound of the first metal on the marble, and Daniel Mercer lowered his eyes and kept them down. Eleanor testified. She did not call the man a monster. "Monsters are a convenience," she told the board. "They let ordinary people feel innocent by comparison and then go right on doing exactly what they were doing." Officer Mercer did not wake up that morning intending to humiliate a veteran in a train station. He made a series of choices, and every single one of them was small enough to excuse on its own. He ignored one detail. He rejected one document. He overrode one colleague. He read one protective movement as defiance. The harm came in through the accumulation. Your decision has to address the process, not just the photograph that ended up on the evening news. The board chairman asked her whether her connection to William Mercer had affected her view of it. "It affected my heart," Eleanor said. "It must not affect your standard. If his conduct is unacceptable because I once operated on his father, then identical conduct toward Lorraine Webb becomes easier to overlook. And Lorraine Webb is the whole point. That badge did not know my history. It was supposed to protect my rights. The department demoted him, suspended him without pay, and barred him from field duty until he completed an independent evaluation and a full retraining program. His promotion eligibility was postponed indefinitely. Some citizens said he should have been fired outright. Others said the discipline was excessive for what they still insisted on calling a misunderstanding. Eleanor refused to let it turn into a referendum on whether Daniel Mercer was a good man or a bad man. "Character isn't a label that excuses conduct," she told a reporter. "The questions are what he did, why the system let him do it, and what is going to stop the next one." 3 days after that hearing, Daniel Mercer drove out to see his father. William Mercer lived in a small brick house in Maryland, where he repaired antique clocks in the front room and grew tomatoes well past the season they were supposed to quit. He was 56 years old. He walked with a cane on account of injuries he had stopped explaining to people somewhere around 1997, and in his whole life he had never once volunteered a story about his service to anybody, including his son. Daniel found him at the workbench, under the magnifying lamp. William did not say hello. He reached over, set a photograph down on the table between them, and waited. It was another copy of the field hospital picture. Daniel looked at it. "Why didn't you tell me?" William took off his glasses. "Tell you what? That Dr. Whitfield saved your life. I told you a doctor did. Told you 100 times. You never said she was black." William looked at his son for a long moment. All around the two of them, 11 clocks ticked at slightly different rhythms, the way they always did, because William had never bothered to synchronize any of them and held that a room full of clocks agreeing with each other was unnatural. "I never said she had brown eyes either," he said. "Why's her color the part you needed?" Daniel looked away. "When you were about 6, William said, you asked me about the scar. I told you a first-rate doctor saw something everybody else had missed. I told you she stayed on her feet all night when the flights couldn't come, and I told you I came home because she wouldn't quit on me." He set the small screwdriver down. "You built a picture in your head out of that. Now, I can't help what you built, but don't hand it to me, son. That wasn't my silence. That was your furniture." Daniel sat down across from him. "I thought she stole them. After you knew she didn't match the description." Daniel didn't answer that. William's voice got quieter then, which made it considerably harder to escape. "Bad judgment doesn't always show up hollering," he said. "Half the time it shows up as certainty. It tells you your first hunch is good sense, and the other fellow's explanation is a story. Makes waiting feel dangerous, when the person standing in front of you doesn't look like the people you learned to trust." He picked the screwdriver back up. "Took me till about 50 to work that out. And I had a lot more reason to know better than you did." The two of them sat there a while. A mantel clock struck the quarter hour, and about 8 seconds later, another one did. "Can you get me a meeting with her?" Daniel asked. "I'll give you an address to send a letter," William said. "Whether she meets you is entirely her business, and I don't want to hear another word about it from you either way." Mercer wrote 7 versions of that letter before he mailed one. He did not explain that the radio message had reached him incomplete. He did not mention stress, or the crowd, or his 10 years of service, or the 2 commendations sitting in his file. He wrote that she had offered him facts, and that he had treated her dignity as resistance. He wrote that seeing his father in that photograph had not made his conduct wrong. His conduct had been wrong the moment his partner read the description out loud. The photograph had only made it impossible to keep the wrongness at arm's length, which he admitted he had been doing successfully for about 4 days. And he apologized for the box, for the handcuffs, and for making a woman stand in a public station and prove a belonging she had earned a dozen times over before he was born. Eleanor read that letter twice. Then she put it in a kitchen drawer and left it there for 3 weeks. She did not owe Daniel Mercer an answer. Forgiveness is not a public utility that comes on when a person turns the tap. But she also knew something else, and it had been sitting with her a while. Accountability with no possibility of growth on the other end of it eventually turns into its own kind of theater. The question in front of her was not whether to release the man from consequences. Those were already in place, and they were not hers to lift. The question was whether a conversation might produce something the consequences could not. She agreed to meet him, on one condition, that William came too. They met on a Saturday afternoon at a veterans rehabilitation center, in a room that looked out on a winter garden with 3 stubborn rose bushes in it. William came in first, and the moment he saw Eleanor, 32 years fell straight off the man's face. "Colonel, Corporal," he laughed, and then he put his hand up over his eyes. Eleanor crossed that room and put her arms around him, and for several seconds, neither one of them said anything at all. Daniel waited by the door. When Eleanor finally turned toward him, he did not offer his hand. He had thought about that on the drive out, and decided he had not earned it. "Dr. Whitfield, I'm sorry. I read your letter. I meant every word of it." "Meaning the words is the beginning of it," Eleanor said. "So tell me this. What are you going to do when the next person cannot produce a general, or a ceremony invitation, or a photograph of your father?" Daniel took a breath. "I'm going to slow down. I'm going to say out loud what I actually know, instead of filling in what I don't. And if I see another officer doing what I did, I'm going to step in. Even if that officer outranks you? Especially then." Eleanor studied him a good long while before she said anything else. "You may become a better officer because this happened," she said at last. "But don't you ever say that it needed to happen. I paid for a lesson you could have learned without using my wrists, and my memories, and my friend's honors as the classroom." Daniel's eyes filled up, and Eleanor did not rescue him from it. "Yes, ma'am." William reached into his jacket and brought out a small envelope. Inside was the photograph he had carried for 32 years, and a note in Eleanor's own handwriting, written on the back of a supply form during his recovery. "Your son is waiting. Heal with purpose." "I think this belongs in the box," William said. Eleanor shook her head and pushed it gently back across the table to him. "It belongs with your son," she said. "He's still working out what purpose costs." In the spring, the walnut box went out to a conservator. The museum offered to replace that damaged hinge with a modern fitting that would be completely invisible. Eleanor turned them down. She asked only that the wood be stabilized and that the visible repair be preserved exactly the way Rosa Alvarez had made it. Brass screws, dark cloth and all. The conservator was an elderly man named Joseph Feld, who had spent 41 years in a basement workroom with a magnifying glass and an enormous amount of patience. He examined the scratches a long time before he said anything. "Most institutions want the damage taken out," he said. "They ask me to make it look like nothing ever happened." "Can you keep it from getting worse?" Eleanor asked him, without pretending it never happened. Feld looked up. He seemed pleased with the question in a way that suggested nobody had asked him one like it in some years. That, he said, is the entire difference between restoration and revision. 2 days into the work, he lifted out the velvet tray to check the wood underneath it. And folded flat against the bottom, where it had been sitting for 32 years, was a piece of paper. It was a supply list, written in pencil, in Ruth Mallory's blocky, unmistakable handwriting, on the night the evacuation failed. 12 units, blood 8, blankets, morphine, clean water working generator, courage. And underneath that last word, in different handwriting, Isaiah Brooks's handwriting, somebody had added 2 words. Already supplied. Feld telephoned Eleanor to tell her what he had found. She drove down that same afternoon. She read it standing up, holding it with both hands, and she laughed out loud. A real laugh, surprised right out of her, the kind you can't stop. And then she sat down very suddenly on a workroom stool and cried for about 4 minutes. Joseph Feld quietly left the room and closed the door behind him, which was, Eleanor thought later, an act of considerable kindness from a man she had met exactly twice. She asked that the list be displayed beside the medals from then on. To her, it said more about who those 9 people actually were than any citation ever written about any of them. They had not thought of themselves as historic, not one of them. They were tired people, making the next necessary choice. And then the one after that. And then the one after that. The remembrance ceremony came back to Union Station the following November. The walnut box sat at the front of the hall. That repaired hinge was still plainly visible under its strip of dark cloth, right where anybody could see it, and Ruth Mallory's supply list was framed beside it now, under glass. Next to them stood a new card, bearing the 9 names, and one line at the bottom. Honor is what we protect when we believe no one powerful is watching. Eleanor arrived an hour early, the way she always did and always had. Samuel Green came as an honored guest and brought his wife, who took somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 photographs. Rosa Alvarez sat right beside them in a blue dress, pointing out her own hinge repair to anybody who came within reach of her. Marcus Bell was there, 23 years old now, reporting for a paper up in Baltimore. He did not record 1 second of it. He said he would rather just watch it this time. Officer Lena Park stood near the back in plain clothes. Helen Crawford flew in again from Ohio. Miguel Santos drove again from Texas, and again would not discuss airplanes with anybody who raised the subject. And William Mercer came in on his cane, with his son walking beside him. Daniel wore no uniform. He was still on administrative duty, and he had stopped mentioning the date of his next review to anyone at all, including himself. He crossed that room and stopped at a respectful distance. "Good morning, Dr. Whitfield." "Good morning, Officer Mercer." He glanced over toward the box. The repair held. "A good repair does more than cover the damage," Eleanor said. "It strengthens the place that failed." The ceremony began without any spectacle at all. The names were read out, one at a time, and a bell sounded after each one. Families came forward and laid white roses beneath the medals. There were 9 chairs at the front again. 6 of them held a rose and a card. 3 of them held Helen Crawford and Miguel Santos and, until she was called up to speak, Eleanor Whitfield. When Naomi Turner's name was read, her brother stood up out of his seat and said, "Present." Nobody had told him to do that, and it undid half the room. And when Leon Grant's name was read, his niece came forward and laid something down on the table beside the roses. It was a single sheet of paper in a plain frame, a young man's unfinished letter, in a young man's careful handwriting, beginning, "Ma, don't worry about me. I'm about the safest one here." She had driven it up from Kentucky in a shoebox on the passenger seat, with a seatbelt across it. At the close of it, General Caldwell asked Eleanor to speak. She stood at the front of the same station where, 1 year before, she had knelt down on marble with red bands around both wrists. Sunlight came through those high windows and found every scratch in the old walnut. "There is a temptation," she said, "to believe that justice is the moment somebody powerful walks in and sets everything right. I understand the appeal of it. It makes a wonderful photograph. Real justice is slower than that, and considerably less photogenic. It is the officer who interrupts a colleague. It is the supervisor who preserves the recording instead of losing it. It is the porter who moves his cart. It is the young man who films the whole thing and blurs the children's faces before he posts it. It is the institution willing to publish the part of the report it would rather bury. And sometimes it is the person who was harmed deciding that the truth has got to become something more durable than an apology." She let that sit a moment. "One more thing, and then I'll sit down, because Helen has been holding a bag of butterscotch for 40 minutes now, and she is about to start distributing it whether I finish or not." The room laughed. Helen Crawford held the bag up without one bit of embarrassment. And then Eleanor's face turned serious again. "A great deal has been made of the general who knelt down on that floor," she said, "and a great deal has been made of a photograph of a young corporal. But the general did not make me innocent. And the photograph did not make me worthy of respect. I was already innocent. I was already worthy. I was worthy standing right there at 8:43 in the morning, before one single person in that station knew one single thing about me. So be careful with any story, including this one, that suggests mistreatment only becomes a tragedy once the person harmed turns out to be somebody extraordinary. Most people are not extraordinary. Most people are just carrying something across a train station, trying to get where they are going. That has to be enough. If that is not enough, then none of the rest of this means very much at all." She looked toward the back of the room, where a man in no uniform stood beside his father. "None of us can change the floor those metals fell on," she said. "But we can decide what gets built on it." After the guests had all gone home, Eleanor stayed a few minutes by herself beside the display. She opened the lid and straightened Isaiah Brooks's ribbon, which had gone crooked again, the way it always did. And she let her fingers rest on the nameplates of 9 people who had worked beside her through one night of rain and fear a long time ago. She could almost hear Ruth telling the whole room to quit being sentimental and get back to work. She could almost hear Isaiah laughing somewhere behind the supply tent. She could almost hear Naomi saying a frightened man's first name, low and steady, the way you'd say it across a kitchen table, until his breathing slowed right down. And she could almost hear Leon sitting on the edge of a cot, asking a soldier with bandaged hands what he'd like his mother to know, and taking it down word for word, and never once making him feel small for needing it. Memory, Eleanor had learned by then, does not ask the dead to stay. It asks the living to carry forward whatever was best in them. She closed the lid. The hinge made a small sound, but it held. Outside, the station went on the way it always had. Trains arriving, trains leaving. Strangers crossing beneath that great clock toward destinations invisible to one another, and every one of them carrying something that nobody else could see. Eleanor Whitfield stepped out into the concourse with the walnut box held against her heart. No general walked beside her. No cameras followed her. Nobody in that crowd knew her name. And she did not need them to. Her dignity had never entered that station with an escort, and it had never, for one single second, been lying on the floor among those medals. It had stayed exactly where her mother taught her to keep it, at a kitchen table in Richmond, Virginia, more than 50 years before. In a place no uniform, no handcuff, and no stranger's failure to recognize her could ever reach.